All right, so I'll talk about the cross-linguistic relationship between word order flexibility and dependency length minimization. So previous work, so the notion of ordering flexibility has existed for a really long time. And whenever people talk or trying to categorize the ordering flexibility of different languages, they tend to rely on the order of the major constituents, including the subject, the head verb, and the direct object. And people tend to treat ordering flexibility as a categorical parameter. For example, English is considered as having relatively rigid word orders, and it's considered to be predominantly SVO. German, on the other hand, is classified as non-rigid OV with much more flexibility than English. On the other hand, Japanese lies somewhere in between, classified as rigid OV, and is considered to have more flexibility than English, but less flexibility than German. And here I want to point out, which is also similar to previous talk, that ordering flexibility should be treated as a gradient parameter and not necessarily only because it looks prettier. And also, whenever we are talking about ordering flexibility, we should also keep in mind the particular syntactic constructions that we're investigating. And what do I mean by that? For example, in English, if we want to describe the head noun argument with an adjective dependent, we tend to put it more consistently before the head noun. And I could say, this is a reasonable argument. On the other hand, if I have a sentence such as, I raised a good point in the paper, where the head verb of the sentence is raised, and I have an adverbial phrase dependent for raised, which is yesterday, I could say, yesterday I raised a good point in the paper, I raised a good point yesterday in the paper. Or I could also put yesterday in the sentence final position. So based on these examples, you could see that yesterday can occur quite flexibly, with similar semantic interpretation for each sentence. Cross-linguistically, on the other hand, if I were to say, I read a book in Mandarin Chinese, where the word read is the head verb of the sentence. And if I assign it with an adverbial phrase dependent, which is the equivalent of yesterday, in Mandarin it's pronounced as 昨天, but doesn't matter here. I could put it more flexibly as long as it occurs before the head verb, but at least in written context, we rarely put it after the head verb or in the sentence final position. So personally, I think there's a gap in the literature on systematic studies of ordering flexibility. And in particular, previously, when people were trying to talk about ordering flexibility, the data they used were either constructed by grammarians or they came from small scale of corpus data. So large scale quantitative studies of ordering flexibility, and in particular, its relationship with other word order properties across languages are currently lacking. So there are a lot of things that we don't know about the relationship between ordering flexibility and other quantitative syntactic parameters yet. So in this study, I focus in particular on the relationship between ordering flexibility and the well-known principle of dependency length minimization. And I'll show that their relationship is less complicated. So previously on the status between the two, people have shown that the extent or the effect for dependency length minimization, and hereafter I'll call it DLM, varies across languages. In particular, it has been shown that there are longer dependencies in rigid head final languages, such as Turkey, as well as mixed type languages, such as Czech. In addition, people have also shown that there are longer dependencies in constituent orders in pre-verbal context in comparison to post-verbal context. So one proposed explanation back in 2010 by Dan Gildia and David Temperley was that These languages in particularly het final or mixed type languages have longer dependencies because they have more ordering flexibility, and thereby the word orders in these languages don't necessarily have to abide by the principle of DLM, but rather they could be more subject to other types of factors such as argumenthood, status, or pronominality. On the other hand, I do think that there's a contrasting point of view here, which is that if these languages are more flexible, then they could instead exploit this flexibility and abide more by the principle of DLM and put shorter constituents closer to their syntactic head. So these are some of the ambiguities that are currently not clear. And in particular, in summary, here I ask, with those arguments in mind, I ask two questions. First, do syntactic constructions with more ordering flexibility have a weaker preference for shorter dependencies? And in particular, are there systematic differences of ordering flexibility and DLM in pre-verbal context as well as post-verbal context? As a test bed, I used sentences that have verb phrases, and the head verb of these verb phrases would have both a direct object noun phrase as well as a PP oblique dependent occurring on the same side, where the two dependents would be right adjacent to each other. For example, I could say Kobe praised his oldest daughter from the stands versus Kobe praised from the stands his oldest daughter. Switching the order of the NP and the PP here doesn't necessarily change the grammaticality nor the semantic interpretation of the sentence. Now, why do I use constructions as such as testbed? So there's a long-standing notion in long-standing principle in linguistics where people have argued that more argument-like phrases tend to appear closer to their syntactic head. And here I treat the direct object noun phrase as the more argument-like element comparing to the PP. And with everything else being equal, ideally, quote unquote, here the principle of argument closer would predict the order of the first sentence where the NP is closer to the head verb praised. And cross-linguistically, with the same syntactic construction in a language like Japanese, when the NP and the PP appear on the same side, they tend to occur before the head verb. And in this case, if we are still abiding by the principle of argument closer, we would prefer the third sentence where the direct object NP is closer to the head verb. On the other hand, in his 2014 book, Jack Hawkins proposed the principle of argument precedence, where he argues that the more argument-like elements, especially from the production perspective, tend to occur first because they're more accessible or more frequent and easier to retrieve based on the production literature. So in this case, let's go back to the English example. Here, again, the NP is considered more argument-like than the PP. And by the principle of argument precedence, NP would be preferred to appear before the PP. And in this case, it is still the first sentence that would be preferred in English. On the other hand, if the more argument-like phrase is preferred to occur first in a language like Japanese, when the NP and PP are pre-verbal, it's actually the fourth sentence that would be preferred, where the NP appears before the PP. So this sort of contrasting patterns here, as well as the in pre-verbal domains in comparison to post-verbal domains, as well as the potential flexibility of the NP and the PP, offers a good test bed for my questions. So for data, I used multilingual corpora from the Universal Dependencies Tree Bank. I focused on contemporary languages, and after pre-processing, I have a data set with 36 contemporary languages, and admittedly, the data set is highly skewed towards Indo-European languages. Regarding measures, For flexibility, I use the measure entropy, which has been adopted by previous studies to measure flexibility using large-scale corpora. And in particular here, the probability represents that of one particular order in either the post-verbal or the pre-verbal context. And here, a higher value of entropy corresponds to more ordering flexibility. Regarding measures for the effect of dependency length minimization, I approximated as the predictive power of dependency length in predicting the order of the NP and the PP within a particular syntactic construction. And here, to exclude the confound of other potential well-known factors, I also controlled for argument whose status, a pronominality of both the NP and the PP, and the head verb in each instance was included as a random effect. And to approximate the relationship between flexibility and DLM, I measured their correlation. In particular, I used Spearman's rule, which measures the monotonic relationship between any given two variables. And a positive value of Spearman's rule indicates a positive correlation between two factors, and a negative value indicates vice versa. So in general, my data, the data showed 3 general patterns. And let's take a look. First pattern is are languages with post-verbal orderings. That is, languages with, when the NP and PP appear on the same side, they occur only after the head verb. And 20 languages appeared with such patterns. And among these, given this graph, x-axis represents the effect of dependency length minimization, and a significant different value from 0 indicates there is a significant effect for dependency length. On the other hand, the y-axis represents the degree of ordering flexibility. A higher value indicates that the order is more flexible. And the Spearman's rule here between the two variables is only 0.08, which indicates there's no specific correlation, be it positive or negative, regardless between these two variables. But I do want to draw your attention to 2 languages in particular here, Hebrew and Portuguese. There's a long-standing notion in the literature on syntactic typology where people have argued that there is a correspondence between flexibility and case marking, in a sense that languages with more rich case markers tend to be more flexible, and vice versa. And that has been shown to be not necessarily the case with a few languages. And here, for example, with Hebrew and Portuguese, neither of them have a rich case marking system, yet they're both quite flexible based on the results here. And by the way, whenever I'm talking about flexibility here, should have said it at the beginning, I'm referring to it within a particular context of the syntactic constructions that I'm looking at. So based on these 2 languages, we could say that flexibility and case marking do not necessarily always correspond to each other. The second pattern in the data set are languages with pre-verbal orderings, and there are 5 languages as such. Although the sample size here of languages with pre-verbal orderings is much smaller than languages with post-verbal orderings. And while admitting that, there seems to be a strong negative correlation between flexibility and dependency length minimization, indicating that in these languages, when the syntactic construction is more flexible, it tends to have a weaker preference for DLM. And I want to draw your attention to 3 languages here, which are Hindi, Urdu, and Japanese. Hindi and Urdu are relatively more difficult to see, but you could take my words for it. And so based on the patterns here, the other ordering flexibility values are quite high, above 0.75. And this means that these rigid OV languages, at least in the context that I'm looking at here, they're actually quite flexible, which is a little bit counterintuition or previous assumptions. The last pattern in my data set are languages with both post-verbal and pre-verbal orderings. That is, when the NP and the PB can occur on the same side, they could both appear either after the verb or before the verb. And 10 languages appeared as such. The green triangle here indicates pre-verbal context, whereas the blue circle here indicates post-verbal context. And the results have shown that there is a strong negative correlation in both the pre-verbal domains as well as the pre-verbal domains, indicating that syntactic constructions with more flexibility have longer dependencies. And I want to draw your attention to two languages in particular here as well, which are Catalan and Spanish. When Catalan and Spanish, when in the post-verbal domains, these two languages are quite flexible, whereas we see the opposite patterns when we're talking about the pre-verbal domains of these two languages. So this refers back to the initial point that I made, which is that flexibility depends on the particular syntactic construction, as well as the particular context that we're looking at. So to sum up, revisiting the questions that I raised at the beginning, let's take an overall look at all languages. I asked two questions initially. First one is, do syntactic constructions with more ordering flexibility have a weaker preference for shorter dependencies? And the answer is yes. Taking all languages into account, there is a strong negative correlation between flexibility and the preference for DLM. Second question I asked was, are there systematic differences of ordering flexibility and DLM in pre-verbal and post-verbal contexts? So the patterns have shown that there are more flexibility in the pre-verbal domains than post-verbal domains. And also, as a side effect, there is stronger predictive power of dependency length in pre-verbal than post-verbal domains, which corresponds and supports previous findings. So what do all of these number countings mean? I think it means three things in particular among everything else, is that whenever we're talking about flexibility, as I have mentioned repeatedly, we should take into account particular syntactic constructions and not just looking at the order of major constituents. And we want to claim traditional, make traditional claims, and as such, we should also support it with diverse sets of data from different registers. And also, it would be nice to see whether the corpus findings could be supported by behavioral experiment. For example, the acceptability judgment text measures to measure flexibility as advanced by SAVI. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. You finished ahead of schedule, so right on time. So we have some time for questions. And again, please feel free to raise your hand or include your questions in the chat. Okay, Luigi has a question, and I'm gonna unmute. Oh yeah, go ahead, Luigi. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. No, thank you for the nice talk. You said that there is a nice flexibility in Portuguese and Modern Hebrew, right? And these languages lack a case. It is certainly true, but I don't know for Modern Hebrew, but Portuguese has a strong agreement. There's a strong agreement between definiteness and noun and adjectives and noun, and so this is very helpful in flexibility. I mean, this is a thing that can help a lot in displacing a word all over the sentence. So it's not just case, I mean, just a quick note.
Right, I completely agree. Thank you very much for your point. Yeah, I guess that's one of the reasons I mentioned whether it's rich case marking or not. And I definitely agree that agreement comes into play in a lot of the questions that we're looking at, and tends to be ignored by a lot of the studies and previous studies. And I guess also depends the particular structure that some people could be interested in. Some of the structure could concern agreement and some of the structure might not, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Natalia has a question, and I'll just ask it. Could you please explain again how you measured DLM, so the x-axis on your graph?
Yes, happily. So the DLM is, I guess, or I tend to call it the effect of dependency length is approximated as the predictive power of dependency length in predicting the order of the NP and the PP. For example, Kobe praised his oldest daughter from the stands, and then the model will be predicting the order of the NP and the PP. And so that the order of the two would be the dependent variable, and the independent variable included in the regression models are argumenthood and pronominality. Argumenthood here is treated as a categorical variable. So if the NP appears closer to the head verb, then that means the more argument-like element appears closer to the head verb. So that will be coded as 1. And then the -1 and 0 could be interpreted accordingly. And also the head verb in each instance is included as a random effect in order to account for some of these verb biases that people have mentioned in the literature. Does that sort of answer your question?
You mean you just use the regression coefficient, the beta, on this dependency?
Yes. Yeah.
Can I ask you, please, what you think about,
yeah.
Because I saw in previous research like Haitan Liu, that's very interesting, that he kind of compared different dependency links across languages. And I'm kind of a little bit doubtful about that. I think it's a little bit risky because this dependency length depends on orthography and how we write, for example, suffixes. So is it a particle or is it a net position, postposition? So this is all conventional. Can we really, so do you think that might influence your results? I don't know. I just, I haven't understood that yet.
I think that's, I think I've said this sentence many times. I think that's a great point. I don't necessarily think, if I should phrase it this way, if I were to speculate without data, I would say that I don't think it would influence the results because, for example, there's strong correlation between either number of characters in a word or dependency length or syllable length, but it would definitely be interesting to investigate that further. I guess one short hand situation is that we don't necessarily have data coded that way across languages. And there's some results, for example, how dependency length effect is weaker in spoken data in comparison to written data. And that's definitely worth looking at in other languages because so far it's still just in English. English is great, but yeah, other languages should anyway. So definitely orthography could be one factor, especially, for example, there's weaker dependency length effect if you find that believable in Mandarin, Chinese, or Persian, where the orthography is quite different from in the other, like English or German or languages as such. So it could be a matter of orthography or just, or maybe the effect is equally strong if we look at syllable length instead. But yeah, I guess that's the downside of computational methods is we tend to don't have like efficient measures to approximate these, but yeah. does that sort of address your
Yeah.
question? Or
Really thrilling question. So thanks a lot for your amazing talk.
thank you.
And I just want to plug, Alex and Natalia are going to talk about some of these things tomorrow. So if you're interested in, for example, case marking and flexibility, Natalia is going to talk about that. And Alex is going to talk about register, spoken or formal versus informal, and dependency length minimization. So you did a great job of like setting up and giving a lot of things for us to think about in general, but also setting up some things coming up. So I wanted to make sure to mention that since we're wrapping up. Other questions and hands? Any hands? I don't see any hands, but other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, I think we'll like sort of wrap up, since I think a lot of us, I mean, I was up early, and I know Zoe is also up. I was up early. So we can wrap up, I think, our session for today. And again, I want to thank all of our speakers for these really amazing talks, and those of you who stuck with us for most of it or all of it. Yes, let's, everyone a hand. You see how we're really all thinking about very similar ideas from different approaches, and that's really exciting to see the synergy here. So I'm really excited about that. And we will have more talks and discussion tomorrow. So stay tuned for that, and I'll be uploading the recorded sessions as soon as I can figure out how to do that. So thank you again, and we will end it there.